Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kumi Now, week 19. Thank you for joining us today as we look at U.S. military support for Israel and what can be done to change that support for the better with our guests from Friends of Sabeel North America. My name is Sarah, and I am a Sabeel volunteer serving as your host today from Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples, and on land promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River. I want to offer respect to elders past and present and acknowledge the important decolonizing work needed here in North America, as well as in Palestine. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this session is being broadcast live on Facebook. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links that is being shared in the chat to invite others to join us today. We are now inviting people from the audience to tell us how you are applying Kumi Now back in your community or are otherwise advocating for Palestine. If you have an idea or project you'd like to share for up to 5 minutes in a future meeting, please email us at kumi@kuminow.com. Now it is time for our weekly activism survey. Mark, could you please launch the poll? Please note that there are 3 questions, so be sure to scroll down for the 3rd question. The first question is about the advocacy last week. What actions did you take related to last week's topic, freedom of speech? Question 2. The US provides over $8.5 million of military assistance to Israel per hour, day, week, or year. And question 3. Biden just restored $235 million in US aid to Palestinians in 2021. This is less than US military aid to Israel in 1971. The amount the US spends on Israel's missile defense each year, the cost of the 3 F-35 fighter jets the Israeli Air Force received in 2017, the amount spent by billionaire Jeff Bezos on his super yacht, or all of the above. All right, so the answer to number 2 is the second answer, per hour. And the answer to number 3 is the final answer, all of the above. The US military aid to Israel in 1971 totaled $277 million in 1971 dollars. The US spends about $500 million on Israel's missile defense each year, and each F-35 costs between $95 million and $144.7 million. And Israel has more than 16 of these already and plans to have 100. And Jeff Bezos reportedly spent $500 million on his super yacht. So we hope that you will find this session interesting and informative. I'd like to start by having everyone you'll be seeing today introduce themselves. Omar, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Omar Harami, and I will be presenting a news update from the ground today. Thank you, Sarah.
I am Rochelle Watson, and I'm the national organizer with FOSNA.
I'm Jonathan, and I am the communications manager with FOSNA.
All right, thank you, everyone. Omar, are you ready to give us an update on the ground for what's going on in Palestine?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. What we usually do here at Sabeel, we give a presentation or a PowerPoint point presentation on what has happened this week. And it wouldn't be accurate if we do it for this week alone. As you, we've been doing or holding these Kumi sessions for almost a year right now on a weekly basis. And this is what's happening in Jerusalem only in the past almost year. Continuous home demolitions, arrests, administrative detention, the confiscation of land, attacks by settlers on holy places, on Palestinian farmers. Human rights violations have been occurring in Palestine and in the occupied territories almost on a daily basis the past year. This month, things exploded. It started with the ending of COVID-19 and easing the restrictions from Israel. Many worshippers at the beginning of the month of Ramadan started to, were eager to go to churches or to go to the mosques, especially Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is where the tension started. Israel started to create barriers and restrictions on the Palestinian worshippers, although they have officially eased all of the restrictions, but when it came to worshippers, Muslim worshippers, Palestinian Muslim worshippers, going to Al-Aqsa Mosque, a number of restrictions occurred, either by throwing tear gas, sound grenades, or just arresting people or using different tactics and violence just to make the lives of people difficult. At Damascus Gate, where most of the restrictions have been occurring, the young people started to resist. In the beginning, it was mainly nonviolent resistance, and what made things explode was that it wasn't only the Israeli police or the army that were imposing these restrictions and creating these harassments. It was also groups of young Israelis, mainly from the far-right movements, who were also organizing demonstrations, protests, and marches in mainly Arab neighborhoods and creating a conflict. For many of you who are aware of Hebron, Hebron is a divided city, where most of the settlements in the West Bank, the settlements are surrounding Palestinian cities and villages. In Hebron, they are inside the city. And this is also identical in Jerusalem, although we do not have always the same attention. In almost every neighborhood today in Jerusalem, we have Israeli settlements or settlers living in the midst of Palestinian communities, and tensions are continuously to be high. One thing led to another. Young people started to challenge the Israeli police and the Israeli settlers, which doesn't happen very often, but it started to happen on a daily basis, and this created a momentum of resistance and steadfastness within the community. More people became impressed, and more people started to join these actions that were taking all around the city. And Jerusalem became a high place of tension. Almost every neighborhood on a daily basis, 24/7, there are frictions between Palestinians in East Jerusalem and Israeli settlers or the army and the police, which feels, for many of us, feels like a civil war. Stone throwing, shouting. There's two neighbors, two different neighbors, if we might call them neighbors, who do not go well together. And it's the fault of Israel. It is illegal by international law to bring, when you occupy an area, to transfer your citizens and to move populations in within the occupied territories, because there is a reason, because it's not healthy, because it's going to create more problems, as we see today in Jerusalem. So today, in the last 24 hours or 48 hours, although most of the actions have been mainly non-violent, some violence started to erupt in different areas, not only by stone throwing or empty bottles throwing at the army or at the settlers, but also with rocket fire, shootings, since yesterday, there has been over 25 people who have died in the last 24 hours. And tensions are very high. People who have cities and towns inside Israel, in Arab towns, have also started to join the demonstrations, people carrying Palestinian flags. The whole country is not well at the moment. The good part of it is that it's very healthy for people to maintain their self-respect and to say no to injustice and to say we're not going to accept it anymore. Another part is the escalation into violence. It's something that we think is not going to be, it's going to make everybody lose, and especially the weaker group, which are Palestinians. So the whole country is not doing well. We appreciate your prayers. It's not only this week Palestine has not been is not doing well. It has been since 1948, and especially from 1967. Palestinians were not always organized to resist the injustice. Does not mean that things were normal and there was peace, and now it's and there's an escalation in violence. The continuous election in the past 4 or 5 elections inside Israel, continuously voting for far-right and right-wing groups, extremists inside Israel, reflects that the society inside Israel is moving into in a situation, they're moving into, Israel is being transformed more and more into less a democracy, more as a dictatorship, or as a police state, which has been for many years, but now Israel does not fight for its image to appear into the international community as a democratic state. Nobody cares now. Nobody cares about how Israel is viewed in the West or around the world. People focus on silencing and putting an end to Palestinians who say no to the unjust policies inside Israel. In a nutshell, this is what is happening. I'm sure many of you are following the news. There has been brilliant nonviolent actions. When the worshippers from Arabs from inside Israel, because the people from the West, Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, are not allowed to have access to Jerusalem, tens of thousands came from inside Arab towns inside Israel to come to worship in Jerusalem. The police stopped all the buses. Unexpectedly, this made it into the social media, and Palestinians from East Jerusalem started going into the other direction with the empty road, with their bikes, buses, cars, trucks, and they started to say it's and Israel could not. All of the Israeli police and army were not able to stop the tens of thousands of people moving into Jerusalem. This disturbed Israel very much, and when people were going into the mosque, more violence erupted. The police stormed into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, throwing tear gas on the holiest night of Ramadan, shooting rubber bullets. A number of people were hit in their head and seriously injured. Tens and dozens of arrests happen in Jerusalem on almost every hour. Almost half of the people that I know are in prison. So the tensions are high, yet the nonviolent resistance, the people who are committed to the nonviolent resistance, continue to be inspiring to everybody around the world. So thank you very much, and that's a short introduction to what's happening.
Thank you, Omar. Definitely sits heavy on our hearts, and I know we're definitely all thinking of you, and we are here to learn and see what we can do today. And so we now turn our attention to the main issue of the week and to our special guests. As they are speaking, if you have a question, please type it in the chat. We will draw all of our questions from what has been put into the chat. and ask them at the end in the question and answer period. So Rochelle and Jonathan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us today. It's lovely to see many familiar faces. I want to just quickly start by saying that my heart is with the families who've been shielding their children from the sounds of bombs in Gaza this week, with the families of the 26 killed, the 9 children, and now 2 Israelis. My heart's also with the families in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan that Omar just talked about, whose looming explosions are absolutely devastating. And as Omar said, just whose resistance we look to for so much inspiration and guidance and leadership. May we all do what we can to end this Israeli occupation and apartheid. And yeah, we're excited to be able to talk to you today about US support for Israel, the role of Christian Zionism, and what we can do to shift US policy and stand alongside the struggle for Palestinian liberation. So again, just really appreciate the opportunity. Jonathan and I are going to share a little bit more about ourselves to start, and then we'll dive into a slideshow. Jonathan, do you want to begin?
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you all today in this time that feels so full. And as they said in the document, the Kairos moment that it feels like we're in. And I really thank you, Omar, for grounding us in what is happening in Jerusalem today, because we're going to be talking about the US influence on that, and it can feel disconnected sometimes. So I really appreciate being grounded in that. And thank you, Rochelle, for that starting intro. My name is Jonathan. I am FOSNA's communication manager. I come to this work as a Palestinian Christian and deeply affected and influenced by Palestinian liberation theology in the work of Sabeel, as well as the Mennonite tradition. And after working in Hebron al-Khalil, which Omar was talking about earlier, with Christian peacemaker teams, I was denied entry by the Israeli military. And since then have been working in the US advocating for Palestinian rights, recognizing, as we will talk about today, the devastating effect that US policy has had on Palestinians. Rochelle?
Thanks, Jonathan. So my name is Rochelle Watson. I am first off a mother of 2 amazing daughters. We live on unceded Ohlone territory, also known as Berkeley, California. I was brought into this work because a fellow community organizer and dear friend, Rachel Corey, was killed by the Israeli military doing human rights work in Gaza in 2003. I, like so many Americans, very little about the situation in Israel and Palestine before her death. After her death, I went to Palestine in 2004 and 2005 and helped start a sister city project between Rafah in Gaza and Olympia, Washington, because it was one of Rachel's goals before she left. I ended up volunteering with the International Solidarity Movement and participated in demonstrations led by villages against the theft of their land by the wall, and also stayed with many communities as a witness to the regular settler violence. I started doing Palestine solidarity work as a job when Rachel's parents started an organization in her name, the Rachel Corey Foundation, and have continued to do the work since. I co-founded Olympia BDS, which led to the Olympia Food Co-op becoming the first US grocery store to boycott Israeli goods. And the backlash of that win was incredibly eye-opening for me. I ended up a defendant in a 10-year lawsuit by Zionists over that decision. And for the last now 6 years, I've been working with FOSNA, focusing on supporting denominational divestment resolutions, supporting local level BDS campaigns, focusing on congressional advocacy, confronting Christian Zionism, and of course, working to end US military funding to Israel. Through this critical advocacy work, we hope to grow this powerful US Christian voice for Palestine that many of you are a key part of. And just to share that I come to this work with just deep, deep appreciation for Palestinian leaders in Palestine, for Sabeel, for Palestinians in the diaspora who teach us so much about how to resist and what it means to continue to struggle for liberation. There are so many lessons and collective power to be gained from deepening our connection with the Palestinian struggle. And I see our own liberation as folks living in the United States on Turtle Island deeply tied to the freedom of Palestinians. So I'm going to attempt to start a slideshow here, which can always be a little clunky. Let's see how this goes. All right. Is it in presenter view, Jonathan? Yes. Okay, great.
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. So, in order to understand US support of Israel and to effectively stand in solidarity with the struggle for Palestinian liberation, it's so important to recognize our own settler history. Both the United States and Israel are European settler colonial states built on the very exclusionary ideology of white supremacy. I think this is so important in order to build the joint struggle we're going to need to change the situation. Both states have a white ruling class that maintains its grip on power through the ongoing exploitation, killing, and displacement of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Since the founding of Israel, Zionism and the US empire have collaborated closely to achieve shared goals. US military assistance to Israel dates back to 1962 when John F. Kennedy decided to sell Israel anti-aircraft missiles. And since then, the US has given Israel over $110 billion in military funding, making it the largest recipient of US foreign aid in history. We recognize that Israel's racial hierarchy is maintained through massive US military and diplomatic support. The latest agreement has the US giving Israel $3.8 billion of our tax money a year, more than the foreign aid to any other country in the world. And the majority of these funds are used to purchase US-made weapons. This has been the case for decades. It doesn't follow along party lines. Aid increased during Obama. I had heard these statistics before I traveled to the region, but the depth of our complicity really didn't hit home for me until I saw the F-16s over Gaza every night, witnessed an Apache drop a bomb in the neighborhood I was staying, saw the US-made bulldozers demolishing homes, the US-made tear gas canisters that Omar was talking about that were flying at Al-Aqsa just this week, seeing them also at families trying to prevent the theft of their grandparents' olive groves. When Trump was president, in addition to continuing the aid, he took many outrageous actions like moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan Heights, which is occupied Syrian land, as Israeli, and which was followed by, and you can almost not make this stuff up, Netanyahu naming some of the stolen land Trump Heights. I don't know if you all saw this in the news. If you all can remember, the deal of the century was Trump's supposed peace plan for the region that attempted to further colonize large swaths of Palestinian land in exchange for economic incentives. These incentives were short-term and filtered through Palestinian businessmen in exchange for selling out Palestinian political rights. President Joe Biden has made clear his administration's staunch support for Israel. He's so far failed to roll back the Trump administration's most damaging attacks on Palestinian rights. And we'll talk a bit more about that current political situation and what we can do about it. But back to why the US supports Israel. In the words of Noura Erakat, a Palestinian human rights attorney, aid to Israel is not just about the US's relationship to Israel, it's about US imperial policy in the Middle East. It's about establishing itself as a hegemon. It's about destabilizing the region. It's about undermining democratic rule. It's about being able to control access to natural resources like gas and petrol. It's about being able to proliferate US military bases in the region that will have access and control to the rest of the world. And we do all of this under the veneer of liberation and democracy and peacemaking. We know Israel is a leading actor in exporting repression globally. This technology is developed using the Palestinian people as a lab. For example, we saw new tear gassing drone technology used on the Gaza Return March that we will likely see now here in the US used against the movement for Black Lives during the ongoing uprising. Israeli and US police trade practices and technology of population control and repression. Jewish Voice for Peace is currently running the Deadly Exchange campaign, which is trying to end the police training relationships between the US and Israel, which in a large part are funded by the ADL. So we know our oppressors are working together in many ways. And as horrifying as it is, it also shows us the necessity of joint struggle, the need to build a mass movement large enough to ultimately end US military aid and defund Israeli apartheid and colonization. And the opportunities for joint solidarity are numerous. So many of the corporations that profit from Israel's apartheid wall are vying for contracts to expand the US-Mexico border wall that Biden just recently said is likely the construction will be continuing, not to Trump's vision, but likely will continue. This was a tweet that Netanyahu posted. President Trump is right. I built a wall along Israel's southern border. It stopped all illegal immigration. Great success, great idea. And here are some images of the prototype that was built by an Israeli company for the wall here, and it was built in California. They had like 8 different companies received $500,000 contracts to build potential prototypes for the wall expansion, and then also Elbit Systems, another corporation that's been involved in the surveillance systems all along the border here. That's an Israeli company. As horrifying as recognizing all the intersections, I think it also shows us the power potentially of that joint struggle. As I said, here you can see there's been a growing number of campaigns targeting these complicit corporations, and organizers are urging cities to end their complicity with these corporations as a way to follow the BDS call and build cross-movement local power. There's a new coalition that just formed called Demilitarize that is really working to link up the struggles to defund police at the city level with the struggles to end US military aid to Israel and to end contracts with complicit corporations. In Portland, there were, it was really powerful to hear Indigenous folks who had recently returned from Standing Rock speaking alongside Palestinian human rights defenders to get the city to end its investments in Caterpillar, for example, and they ended up ending all corporate investments, which was a partial win. We see more and more justice struggles in the US recognizing their connections to the Palestinian struggle. Black Palestinian solidarity has a long legacy. The Dream Defenders have been very active in drawing connections and sending delegations. There's an org called Black for Palestine that put out a powerful statement a few years ago, signed by 1,000 Black activists, artists, and intellectuals calling for increased solidarity with Palestine. We know there's immense power in these acts because of the depth of Zionist attacks on people of color in the US when they lift up the Palestinian struggle. And there's been so many examples of this just in the last couple years, from Mark Lamont Hill losing his job with CNN after speaking at the UN, to Angela Davis being denied an award from her hometown that was eventually given to her. At FOSNA, we now have a Black Christian network for Palestine that's made up of young Black Christian leaders who are meeting regularly to help bring the Black church into alignment with Palestinian struggle. They released the Black Church Call to End Israeli Apartheid in 2019 and are working on a video this year with prominent Black clergy reading the statement. So those are some examples of this growing cross-movement solidarity. Jonathan?
Yeah. When we have these conversations about how pro-Israel the US is, and really how anti-Palestinian the US is. There's always the question that comes up of why. And there's a lot of answers to that. And I think Nura Erekat's quote is a really helpful framework for this as well. But one of the things that's often not looked at so deeply is the role that Christian Zionism has in pushing US policy around Palestine. Going back to Nura Erekat's quote about Israel being a settler colonial nation, in the Native American activist, scholar, and author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talks about the US, talks about covenant nations as a specific type of colonial nation. These are places that were founded with the idea that God gave them the land, that God took the land from the native people and was giving it to the settlers. And she names 3 examples of this: the US, apartheid South Africa, and Israel. And so it's there is a deep religious component of this belief that God cares about some people more than others, that God gives land away to some people and takes it from others based on their ethnicity. This is obviously fundamentally a racist idea. And we see this most clearly in Christian Zionism, which is a fundamental idea of Christian nationalism in the US. I am sure that many of you have heard about Christian Zionism and much of what's wrong with it. This is something that Sabeel has taken the lead on. In our picture here, we have the book that Sabeel put out, Naeem Atik, Cedar Tobias, and Maureen Tobin, who is now on FOSNA's board, edited this collection of essays by Palestinians challenging Christian Zionism. And so this is the call that FOSNA has been responding to in our work of challenging Christian Zionism, because we recognize that Christian Zionism is a huge issue in the US, not just around Palestine, but it is the ideological foundation of much of the right-wing repression that we face. When FOSNA started challenging Christian Zionism, we found allies in the African-American community who recognized that it's the same belief system that pushes Christian Zionism, that pushes anti-Black racism. We connected with indigenous activists who recognized that it's the same Christian Zionism that is fueling the anti-indigenous and colonial struggles. Hey, Rochelle, could you go back to the slideshow? And oftentimes, when we talk about the US being pro-Israel, we talk about we talk about Jewish support for the state of Israel in the US. We talk about organizations like AIPAC and maybe even the Jewish lobby. But if you look at the numbers and the influence, Christian Zionism plays a gigantic role. You have past presidents and vice presidents who fully believe in Christian Zionism. If you look purely by the numbers, there are more Christian Zionists in the US than there are Jews in the US, let alone Jewish Zionists, which is a diminishing population or diminishing belief. There are estimates that say between 20 and 25% of the entire US population, not just the Christian population, but all of the US, hold some Christian Zionist beliefs, that Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, that it is playing a role in the end times, or simply that God will financially bless Christians who quote unquote bless the current state of Israel. In this way, Christian Zionism connects to the prosperity gospel, which is antithetical to how I read the gospel and what liberation theology teaches, and that is a preferential option for the poor. And Christian Zionists are extremely well organized as well. The largest Christian Zionist organization in the US is Christians United for Israel. They claim to have millions of members. Just their Facebook page has over 1 million members. This is something like 5 to 10 times the number that AIPAC claims. So we're talking about a huge demographic that is pushing US policy. That is Christian. And I'm speaking here to a group connected with Sabeel that is promoting Palestinian liberation theology in a Christian context. So this is one of the ways where we can most directly affect US policy, by challenging Christian Zionism. And it's some of the work that FOSNA has been about. 2 years ago, we started protesting at CUFI's annual summit. That's one of the pictures on the screen right now. And then the next year, when CUFI, this is last year, when CUFI took their summit online, we protested online with a Twitter storm where we overtook their messaging and replaced it with the truth about what was going on in Palestine. So I want to end by saying that while the US support of Israel is very strong, we see that it is very much being pushed by Christian Zionists who know very little about what's actually going on in Palestine, who their Christian Zionism is part of a larger Christian belief, but it's not the center, and who are greatly influencing US policy. For us, this is an opportunity to challenge that narrative and to change US policy from the grassroots. And with that, I'll let Rochelle talk a little bit more about the influence of Christian Zionism and the influence of US policy on both parties.
So let me move the slide here and continue. Okay. So actually, well, it's okay. I think we can stop the slideshow for a moment. All right. So as I mentioned before, Biden has yet to roll back Trump's horrific policies. Even before the election, Blinken, who's now Secretary of State, reassured the Israeli lobby that under Biden, US funding for Israel's military would remain unconditional. Since the election, top Biden officials, including Blinken, have reaffirmed their hostility to BDS. But the good news is that recent Gallup polls show how disconnected these hardline anti-Palestinian positions are with the Democratic Party base. And this is a confirmation of trends that we've been seeing for a long time. In this recent poll, more than half of Democrats now want the US to put more pressure on Israel than on Palestine. 53% of Democrats were insisting on this pressure to happen, which was up just from 43% in 2018 and 38% in the decade before that. So it shows the major shift in perspective on US policy. And we also saw this clearly in Bernie Sanders, right? While running for president, as a Democrat, proposed making US aid to Israel conditional on Israel's treatment of Palestinians, which was a major shift from what we've been hearing in leadership for many decades. Biden did reverse Donald Trump's decision to cut off all humanitarian aid to Palestinians, but they also, as I said before, made it clear that they're fundamentally not going to change the U.S.-Israel relationship. In Biden's campaign in 2020, he called the idea of conditioning aid to Israel bizarre, and has really stocked his administration with pro-Israel officials who've really ruled out pressuring the country over its treatment of Palestinians. So one of the most important parts of our work right now is reaching our Democratic representatives and urging them to join those of us who are advocating for Palestinian rights. So even if we're not seeing at the top level of the Biden administration, we're seeing massive shifts right within the House in terms of members of Congress willing to actually speak out for Palestinian rights. We are working with the Invest in Justice Coalition to really build that pressure. And we've done it through a whole bunch of small campaigns, like we did run around medical apartheid earlier this year. And right now we're working in a large coalition to try to put pressure to stop the Jerusalem expulsions and what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and in so on. And we're gaining ground. Last year we saw the statements from, Rashida Tlaib, from Ilhan Omar. AOC put forward a Dear Colleague letter conditioning aid to Israel if the threats to continue annexation happened. And just in the last week, we've seen an incredible showing of support for the families in Sheikh Jarrah, from Bernie Sanders, Senator Warren, Mark Pocan, some new names, folks who have not spoken out on Palestinian rights before in the House, speaking out. And I can put a link in the chat. JVP on Twitter is keeping track of all of the tweets and statements coming in from different representatives. So we see this as a really promising start to a shift. And Jonathan's going to talk a bit more concretely about what we've been doing around the Jerusalem expulsions and how you can get involved in that important work. Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks for setting that context, Rochelle, that we're starting to see some members of the US government shift, but really those at the center of power, the president, the State Department, is unfortunately stubbornly pro-Israel. But as liberation theology teaches us, we don't look to the government to lead the way. It is not in the halls of power, but it is with those who are speaking truth to power. It's the prophetic voice that will bring about the needed changes. So we continue to demand freedom from the occupation, justice for refugees, and equality for everyone who lives in that land. We will not water down our messages so that it is easier for those in power to swallow, but we unabashedly uplift the call of the oppressed. And we are doing that right now in speaking to Israel's planned expulsion of Palestinians from Jerusalem, specifically the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. FOSNA started working with folks in Silwan because the reason Israel gave for their expulsion and home demolitions there was that they wanted to build a biblical tourist site, mostly for Christian Zionist tourists to come visit. So we started to look for campaigns around that. And when we heard of the imminent evictions around Sheikh Jarrah, Rochelle helped pull together a coalition of US-based organizations, some organizations around the world, and Palestinian organizers in Jerusalem to talk about what the leverage points we had at this point in the process, as it seems that Israel and the Israeli military has made up their minds to go forward with the expulsion, which is part of Israel's ethnic cleansing plan for Palestinians. And the group together recognized that the US State Department would be a key group to put pressure on, specifically Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Hadi Ahmad. And so we set up a petition with the hope of getting 10,000 signatures. And we are delivering that petition today. And as we speak, there are over 200,000 names signed to that petition. It has grown further than we could have ever believed. US politicians have begun to following in the footsteps of the grassroots movement, putting together their own letter demanding that the State Department put as much pressure on Israel as it possibly can to not go through with these expulsions and demolitions. And because this is literally happening right now, you can participate in this effort. Right after this call is over, the petition is going to be delivered, and the coalition is putting extra pressure on the State Department through a Twitter storm, inviting people around the world to tweet at Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the US State Department. And you can even put a, FOSNA and the coalition has put together a toolkit to actually help you write those tweets even more easily. We have sample tweets and Facebook messages. This is one of the most direct ways that you can talk to the US State Department and let them know that they need to respond to that petition. There's also a way that you can uplift the letter that if you're in the US, that you can ask your representative to also sign on to the letter written by Representative Newman that's going to the State Department, also putting pressure on the State Department to not allow Israel to go through with these expulsions. So it's like we said, it's a very difficult time for those in Jerusalem, but it's exciting to see the massive outpouring of support from around the world for Palestinians right now. And we hope that you'll be a part of that. And Rochelle is going to share a bit more about some of the long-term campaigns so that we're not only reacting, but being proactive as well.
Yeah, so those are some of the short-term campaigns to gain congressional support, but our long game campaign right now is to, and of the Invest in Justice Coalition, is to encourage US representatives to sign onto the new Betty McCollum bill, which is HR 2590. And I will switch the slide here so you can see. So this, the Palestinian Children and Families Act was introduced just a couple weeks ago by Representative Betty McCollum, and she's a US representative from Minnesota. Many of you have probably been working on the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. Since 2015, she's been the leading congressional critic of Israel's detention of Palestinian children. She's introduced multiple pieces of legislation that would bar Israel from using US military aid to arrest Palestinian youth. Her hope was by targeting Israel's detention of Palestinian children, just one aspect, of course, of the horrific occupation, but one that involves such a highly vulnerable position, she could help her bills appeal to the widest swath of Democrats possible. And so this year's bill is even stronger than those previous. This one prohibits Israel from using US taxpayer dollars in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem for military detention, abuse, or ill treatment of Palestinian children, as our previous bills have, but also to any time that funding is used to support the seizure and destruction of Palestinian property and homes in violation of international humanitarian law, or to extend any assistance or support for Israel's unilateral annexation of Palestinian territory and violation of international humanitarian law. So it's much stronger and broader. There were 13 original co-sponsors, but it came out very, very fast. So there was very little time for us to gather and to add pressure to those co-sponsors. But we have this whole next year to really try to get as many reps to sign on to this bill and to sponsor this bill. So we'll put a link in the chat on how you can send a letter to your representative to make sure that they are supporting this bill. And we're going to have the next meeting of the FOSNA Activist Network, which is members of FOSNA who are really active in doing a direct advocacy in their local community. This group we're going to meet with the leaders who've really been supporting McCollum in this legislation, Brad Parker from the Defense of Children International, and also Beth Miller, who's JVP's legislative advocacy director. We're going to just kind of share together who signed on, who hasn't. We're looking for folks in certain cities where we think their reps with enough pressure would very likely sign on. We have a whole strategy around how to just get as many folks, sponsors as possible. And we're also going to hear from FOSNA members who've been doing this work for a very long time on what they found is the most effective way to reach their representatives, including folks that live in Betty McCollum's district that have sort of led her into being such a beacon. And so if you're interested in being, if you're not already in the FOSNA Activist Network and would like to be, you can send an email to me. And we can put my email in the chat, rochelle@fosna.org. And also just encourage folks to join FOSNA's mailing list so you can keep up to date, because anytime we launch a new one of these tools, we send it out to the full list so that we can get thousands of folks to reach out to their representatives in a short window of time. Jonathan.
So in conclusion, and to give us time to take some of these actions, I just wanted to say that this work of challenging US policy feels deeply connected for me to the work that Jesus calls Christians to speak truth to power, to stand and uplift the voices of the oppressed. I remember the words of Assis Naim. He said, "To say that scripture is fulfilled is to take a stand for justice and to struggle to confront injustice, racism, violence, discrimination, and everything that corrupts and dehumanizes." And this is why FOSNA's activism, we don't primarily spend time talking to those in power, but mobilizing the grassroots and helping connect different efforts to shift US policy. And this is why FOSNA mobilizes churches. We believe that when the church in America confronts Christian Zionism and takes up its prophetic duty to stand for justice, we will see real change. So FOSNA offers presentations on Palestine and on Christian Zionism to churches. Please invite us to your congregation to speak about this. And we also, in that time, will always encourage churches to speak about Palestine from the pulpit. Because too often, from the pulpit, you hear things that are pro-Israel or can be construed as pro-Israel. So how do we change that? Last year, we got 100 churches to preach Palestine on the first Sunday of Advent. We're hoping to double that number this year on November 28th. Keep an eye out for new resources that are going to be coming out soon for that and for ways that your church can sign up for it. You can, if you're not on FOSNA's mailing list, please get on it because we're going to be rolling this out very soon. And so let us together as one body continue in the struggle, lifting up Palestinian voices, speaking truth to power, and proclaiming liberation.
Thank you so much, Rochelle and Jonathan, for sharing all that important information about how the U.S. is very complicit, has been all along, and some things that we can do. I have some questions from folks who posted it in the chat. Again, a reminder, if you have any questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat. We won't be taking any raised hand or speakers. There was a question, you've maybe addressed some of this, but it was posted early on about Christian nationalists and Zionists spend many millions lobbying in Washington for Israel, more than what they spend on local needs. What can we do to stop them?
You want to take that one, Jonathan?
I feel like we spent the last 10 minutes answering that.
Yeah, that's fine. If there's anything else you want to add, or
I mean, continue to do grassroots efforts in your community. Like who needs to hear about this in your church, in your community? How do you get the message out there? And if there's a way FOSNA can help you with that, please let us know.
Thank you. We had several questions about really someone struggling to understand the why behind these like covenant nation mentalities. Why did God deal up this real estate? Why doesn't God like some people? And I'm wondering if there are perhaps other people have commented with some resources for education. Perhaps you would have some other resources or something you would like to say in response to that.
I wanted to just, I've had one thought about the last question too. I just wanted to offer that one thing we are doing more of is webinars for congregations on Christian Zionism or on church advocacy for Palestine and what that can look like. So know that reaching out to us, and again, I can put my email in that, we're excited to organize, and we're actually building leadership of younger Christians to do this type of advocacy, to educate on Christian Zionism and on the situation and why we as Christians must engage in this work. So help build their leadership too by inviting us to come in and speak to your congregation. Jonathan, did you have an answer to the second question too?
Yeah, I mean, why colonial Christianity is a hard question to answer. I was just having this conversation with my partner the other night. How is it that white people made themselves the center of the gospel? Was the question that she asked. That because all of these nations are European colonizers, right? So how did they think that God preferred them when the gospel was brought to the world in Palestine? So for me, the response to all of this is liberation theology, is bringing scripture back to its homeland of Palestine and looking at it through Palestinian eyes. It's the work that Sabeel has been doing. I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but it's what I have now.
Yeah, I mean, it can be very hard, to understand that mentality. We have a few other questions here. One, someone posted that they know that their representative has signed the Lincoln letter, but they're wondering if you have a list of who else has signed the letter so far, or if you know who else.
There is the Dear Colleague letter. I'll pull it up. I can pull it up and put it in the chat, the list of so far. But today is the last day to do so. So I'll put the link, even more importantly, for those of you, because the majority, of course, have not yet signed on. So today is the day to send emails and put pressure, because Dear Colleague letters are such a short window, and it'll be introduced tomorrow. So now's our chance. So I'll put the link for that, and then I'll see if I can find the names.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rochelle. I also saw some comments about wondering about like this talk today was very much focused on the US, but Canada and the UK's complicity as well. I know that there are Friends of Sabeel networks there as well. Perhaps someone would like to share some information about that, or where we can learn more about other countries' complicity.
Omar, do you have anything to say about that? The best way for folks to connect with Friends of Sibyl networks in their home countries.
As Sabil, we have 11 different Friends of Sabil around the world, and they are all like FOSNA doing amazing work. It will be easier. Some of you I know that are already affiliated with some of the Friends of Sabil, but in the next newsletter that we will be sending out, we will include addresses, how you can join their lists if you're not already part of the list. Each group is engaged with their own advocacy work, whether it is education or educational or influencing the decision makers in their churches or in their community to make the right decisions when it comes to Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Omar. We actually also had a question for you specifically around your update on the ground. They said that what you're describing sounds like an intifada. Is that how you see it?
You know, throughout the last 10 years, we've had a number of cases similar to this case. Some of them just end up a week or 2 weeks of uprisings, and some of them last for longer. We're not yet into a third intifada. We will have to wait and see, and hopefully it will be an nonviolent intifada. So there's so many unknowns. It really depends on the leadership on the ground, the people who are doing the work. There's people who want to push it for violence. There's people who want just to have an end of this uprising. I've just been getting reports in Lid and Ramle, which are close to the airport of Ben Gurion Airport, where people are going out and burning police cars. And people are very upset because there was a shooting of a member of their community yesterday, although he was part of a non-violent demonstration. He was shot and killed. 7 are seriously injured. So there's so much anger. How does this turn into from just a reaction to a movement is yet to be seen. There's so many unknowns. No one can really predict what is happening. But time in almost every Arab town inside Israel, demonstrations are taking place.
Thank you, Omar. So it is new with Kumi now that we are wanting to provide time to do the activism during this session, because that is such an important piece of what we are trying to do. So I'll move on now to introducing the different actions for you this week, of which there are many, many possibilities. Also definitely want to thank everybody for their questions. Thank you, Omar, Rochelle, and Jonathan for all your sharing with us. We'll continue to hear a bit more from you. So first I'll introduce the Kumi Now action. Then I'll ask Rochelle and Jonathan to speak more about what they'd like you to do for their actions. And then we'll have 10 minutes to complete and get started on these actions. So Ryan, could you please put the Sabil options on the screen, or the Kumi Now options? And they will also be shared in the chat so that you can access them that way. So today's Kumi action is actually focusing on doing some research on your own state, congressional district, county, and city. How much of the military aid going to Israel is provided locally? And what could be funded instead with this money to benefit your own community rather than sending military aid to Israel? So there's a website, militaryaidtoisrael.org, that can help you learn these details through their interactive map. If you do not live in the United States, you can do your own research into your local government's support of Israel and share that knowledge with the Kumi community. Once you have figured out this knowledge about your local government's involvement, you can visit citiesforpalestine.org and explore options to engage and mobilize your local community to support Palestinian rights and bring the struggle for freedom, equality, and justice to your city. They have examples of other successful campaigns and toolkits that they'll give you to do that. And we really encourage you to post any photos or other evidence of your actions to social media and include a link to the Kumi Now website page with the hashtags City for Palestine, Cities for Palestine, hashtag Kumi Now, and hashtag Kumi19. Rochelle and Jonathan, would you like to talk about the FOSNA actions? I know you have a bit already, but I think there's even more listed here. Yeah.
Absolutely, because we have two actions that literally are for a limited time only. For the next hour, we're asking people around the world, if you have Twitter, to use that to tweet at the US Department of State, specifically Secretary Antony Blinken and Hadi Amar. And we can share with you, I think Rochelle will share with you the toolkit that you can use. If you have Twitter, that we literally already have the tweets written for you. You can copy and paste it to make sure that to uplift the petition that we are sending to them now that has over 200,000 signatures from people all over the world. So that's one action you can take right now. The Twitter storm just started, and we're hoping to get a whole bunch of tweets in this hour. You can also retweet anything that FOSNA has shared in the last few minutes. We had it automatically going for a bit. And then the other action is, if you're in the US, to ask your representative to sign on to a letter to the US State Department with the same demands that they speak up about the possible demolitions and expulsions of Palestinians in Jerusalem.
And I can put the link to the language of that Dear Colleague letter if you wanted to see it as well. But if you just click on that last link that I just posted, you'll be able to right there send a letter to your rep asking them to sign on to the Dear Colleague letter. But I will also put the letter itself, a link to the letter itself in the chat. And then just to also lift up that longer term strategy of really getting as many reps to sign on if you're in the US to Representative McCollum's bill. And I'll put that link as well in the chat. And to think locally, to even, have a small meeting about to try to get into their office and to think about ways to really increase the pressure and who would be the most influential people to bring with you. Most reps are still doing their calls on Zoom. So it's a great way to bring in other voices now because it's so accessible. So think about, who could you pull together to speak to your representative. So that last link is the Dear Colleague letter that again will go out tomorrow that we're trying to get last minute signatures on. And then here is the long-term McCollum bill effort where you can also write your rep. And for those of you that might not use social media often, which I totally understand, I even at 45 feel outdated when it comes to Twitter. Just to really say it's quite easy because you can just go to FOSNA's Twitter page and just hit the retweet button on the tweets that we've already put out. So you don't have to do a lot of fancy footwork. You do have to have a Twitter account, but then you can just retweet. And because it has the as part of the tweet, then all of those tweets go to one location where the target, in this case, Blinken, as well as there's some secondary targets, will see all of that. And it's a really great way to bring attention in a quick way.
Mm-hmm. There was a quick question in the chat saying that at Secretary Blinken, SEC Blinken can't be messaged. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so the tweets have to be just public tweets. You cannot private message the State Department, unfortunately. But what happens is they are aware, especially when there's a large number, they probably won't see the words you have to say, but they will see that, you know, this many tens of thousands of tweets went out towards us about Sheikh Jarrah and about Silwan, and it puts more pressure on them to respond. So that's the strategy behind what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there is a lot for us to do. And also, given the ongoing situation in Sheikh Jarrah, we will be sharing information about actions you can take for the family there. Does anyone want to address this slide? I will just have it up there as information for you that you can do this as well. So we are going to take 10 minutes to do this. We'll put some music on and offer some support in the chat if you're running into issues. So thank you so much. We hope you stay with us to do this important activism, and then we'll close with promoting next week's session. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. A link to the video of this gathering, along with all the links shared today, will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or so. And it will be shared in the next newsletter. You can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you receive them. We would greatly appreciate it if you would share this amazing session with your friends and colleagues, as well as information on future sessions. I'd like to thank our guests, Jonathan and Rochelle, for being with us today. Thank you for your time and for your work. Is there any last thought you'd like to leave with us?
Just deep appreciation for Kumi now and for all you all do, and for each of you today that took the time to take action. And let's just keep increasing the pressure. Thanks.
And thanks to everyone here for the years of commitment that I know are represented in this Zoom room on behalf of the Palestinian people. Thank you so much for being in the struggle, and may we continue.
Thanks again. Looking forward to our next week, we will be marking Nakba Day on May 15th and discussing how the policies that led to the Nakba are still alive and strong, as witnessed in the Sheikh Jarrah expulsions, leading to what we call the ongoing Nakba. If you'd like to be reminded of the online gatherings an hour before they begin, you can register for email reminders at kuminow.com/online using the form at the bottom of the page. And as always, if you have any feedback on this gathering, you can email us at kumi@kuminow.com or fill out the feedback form at kuminow.com/feedback. We hope to see you back here next week. Thanks again, and hope everyone enjoys what is left of their day.